What doesn't split us makes us stronger, aka how I have improved the lifespan of my favorite jeans by hand mending with a simple running stitch. This technique was shared with me from Lauren at Maydell Craft in Chicago, and with her blessing, I'm now sharing it with you. Step 1. Assess the damage. Are you missing fabric, or has it just ripped along the grain of the fabric? Does anything need a haircut? Are there any loose and fraying ends? This is your moment to really figure out what your approach to your mend is going to be. You're trying to assess what you'll need to do to bring the fabric back to as original a state as possible. These holes are actually not areas where the fabric is missing, it's just where the warp threads have ripped. So I can distort it into a big gaping hole, but I can also smooth it back into alignment. Step 2. Measure for your patch. You want to get an overall approximation of what size your hole needs to cover, and ideally, you want your patch to have enough wiggle room all around it. A hole like this usually means that the overall fabric has been worn down and weakened, so the extra fabric of the patch will help stabilize the entire area. If you follow me on Instagram, you may know that I sliced up a whole bunch of old jeans into long strips to make a rug. Tutorial for that coming soon if you want to subscribe. But that meant that I had a lot of weird bits like this pocket lining. The material is still really sturdy and it's perfect for using as a patch. I'm trying to find denim that's a shade or two darker than my original jeans. This may be a little bit dark, but you can use what you have. It will mostly be invisible in the final mend. I'm cutting the pocket facing fabric away from the pocket lining fabric and assessing the grain. When you have your patch, make sure it's nice and smooth, so give it a good press. I like using this little spray bottle because I have an old iron that doesn't always give a good steam anymore. Now that we have our patch, I want to talk about fabric again. Denim is a twill fabric, meaning that it's woven in an offset pattern that looks sort of diagonal. This makes it nice and stretchy along the bias, but still tough and durable along the straight grain. Bias is what happens when you take these warp threads and weft threads going perpendicular to each other and stretch them along at a 45-degree angle. Instead of each warp or each weft thread going straight up and down, no stretch unless they're spandex, now both threads are basically being pulled from the middle rather than each end, and there's more space for them to flex in the spaces between the threads. The straight grain is the line of the individual threads going across, and this is also what frays. More on that later. Denim can be hard to see the straight of grain sometimes because of the diagonal weave structure. So if you're having a hard time, you can look at the face of the fabric where it should be much more clear what the straight of grain actually is. Now, step 3, back to the pants. Before we baste, you want to give everything a little trim. Anything completely loose and fraying can be cut away. Baste the holes back together. You're using a simple back and forth and not pulling tight. The goal is not to distort or seal up any holes, but rather to stabilize the fabric the way it used to be, which will allow our stitching to reinforce the holes the way they want to be. If you pull tight, then the fabric will pucker and the fit of your jeans will change. You're really just trying to keep things nice and orderly with this basting. Step 4. Place the patch and baste it to the hole. I start by checking my grain, making sure that I get the patch in the right orientation, and then I smooth it flat over the hole. I pin it in place, making sure it's smooth and not distorting the existing fabric. See how much easier it is to see the straight of grain on the front of this denim rather than the back? I'm flipping it back and forth just to make sure that I'm lining the bias up with the straight of grain of the pants. I want my patch on the bias and I want the straight of grain on my pants. I also want to make sure that as I place it, I get the base of the fabric as my darker color to be under the hole. Once I'm comfortable with how it's placed, I pin it into place and then I baste the patch to the hole. I prefer basting to holding it with pins since I'll be sewing this by hand, and I sometimes will get the thread snagged on the head of a pin. I like to just get it cleaned up. I also like to not stab myself in the hand every time I pick the project up. You can baste with just a simple running stitch around the outside edge of the patch. I usually start with a few stitches on top of each other as a tack so I don't accidentally pull my thread loose. Once you are done basting and all of the pins are removed, it's a great time to do a quick fit check. Here, you're looking to make sure that nothing's bunching or stretching strangely before you do all of your nice hand stitching. Step 5, pick your thread. I'm using orange for my sample so that you can see what I'm doing, but for my invisible side, I'm going to use the closest color that I have in my stash. It helps if you go about one shade darker than the area you're trying to mend. Again, for visual clarity, I'm using all 6 strands of the thread. When you're working invisibly, I find it helps to divide your embroidery floss in half. Cotton embroidery floss is made from 6 strands, which are loosely spun together, but can be separated. And for this project, I found that 3 strands worked best for me. It's a subtle effect, but it's strong. Step 6. Using a running stitch, sew along the grain of the fabric of the original pants. You can bury your end of your thread in the space between the patch and the original fabric. Stitch about an inch above and below your hole. This is about reinforcing the fabric and getting both pieces of fabric to work together as a single unit. You want to make sure you're following the grain line of the original fabric. This keeps you going straight as long as you follow the thread. If the vertically running threads of your fabric are not as easy to see as mine are here, you can draw yourself a few guidelines to make sure that your rows of stitching are nice and parallel. I prefer to follow the thread if possible. You can think of your work as essentially weaving new threads along the original warp to strengthen it. When you get to the end of the row, take a perpendicular stitch to start your next column of stitches, about 1/8 of an inch away from your first line of stitching. And now keep going. The emphasis here is going to be on filling this whole area with nice, neat lines of stitching. Step 7. Once you've covered the area you're patching, go back in between your rows to fill in over the hole and to tack down loose threads. This fill area is also where you can let the stitches try to cover any loose or fraying threads that you didn't snip. And now we're going to jump a little bit ahead. I have now done this work on the other side in our 3-stitch matching blue color, which is what you're going to see next. Step 8. Remove your basting stitches. If you don't have a seam ripper, you can use the blunt edge of your scissors to pull the thread loose. Aren't you glad I used the orange to show you how to do this? It's almost invisible. It's very, very hard to see at this point where exactly the stitches are. Step 9. Trim your patch down to the area that you stitched. This is where the second magical property of bias comes into play. Anything cut on the bias does not fray because the threads are trapped. When you pull the outside thread on the straight of grain, it doesn't have anything holding it in, and therefore you can basically unweave your fabric by removing those straight threads. Cutting on the bias means that there are no loose threads that aren't held in place by their neighbors. You can use any small, sharp scissors to create a pinking effect to introduce little bias cuts where otherwise it would be straight grain and therefore fray. Step 10. Wear these out and about and enjoy knowing that you literally have to get all up in my business to see where this mend is at all. These are virtually invisible for any everyday wear. These jeans are now able to re-enter my closet, and I hope to get many more years of use from them. Thanks for watching.